Richard, one potential issue, our hosting fees could become a challenge as we scale.
Right, but we can offset a lot of that once we get a few customers and start a subscription revenue model.
What? Revenue? No revenue. I'll call you back. What? Why would you go after revenue?
Because to make money?
No. If you show revenue, people will ask how much, and it will never be enough. The company that was the 100Xer, the 1000Xer becomes the 2X dog. But if you have no revenue, you can say you're pre-revenue. You're a potential pure play. It's not about how much you earn, it's about what you're worth. And who's worth the most? Companies that lose money.
In one of the most famous scenes from the Silicon Valley TV show, a series I highly recommend, Russ Henneman tries to convince the main character, Richard, to operate as a pre-revenue tech startup to maximize his valuation. In tech, pre-revenue is often viewed as a bit of a joke, but in biotech, it's just the standard way of doing things. All companies start out as pre-revenue as they spend money to develop their new drugs and go through clinical trials, and if they succeed, they eventually earn a lot of revenue and become very valuable. The difference is that unlike with tech startups, everything is much more grounded in reality in the form of real data on patient populations, pricing, and the time required to ramp sales, which are all linked to historical precedents. In this tutorial video, I'll explain the main points of biotech valuation, walk you through a simple example, and provide links to bank-issued valuation presentations and fairness opinions for biotech companies. And yes, we do now have a course on biotech valuation, so this is effectively an excerpt from that training. If you want to learn more, you can see the full link and course description on our site. As usual, I'm going to start with the short version of biotech valuation and then go into more of the Excel work and the nuances. Okay, so let's get started with the very short version of biotech valuation. At a high level, the most important methodology is the far in the future DCF, where you forecast the company's revenue, expenses, and cash flows over 20 to 30 years, and the revenue is based on the potential patients times the market share times the price per patient. The revenue normally takes about 4 to 8 years to ramp to reach what is called peak sales, and then it eventually falls to zero over time as generic competitors enter the market and force prices down and reduce some of the demand. So I'm going to pull up this example from our Antios Therapeutics simple DCF example right here, and you can see it. The unadjusted potential revenue is equal to our total patient count times the average price per patient. The total patient count effectively is the market share times the addressable patient population. And what ends up happening here is that the revenue takes roughly 7 years to hit its peak, 6 years actually, and then it starts declining after that, and then it really falls off a cliff from year 14 into year 15 as generic competitors enter the market. With the expenses and the cash flow lines, these are actually somewhat more important in the early years because it costs a lot of money to develop the drugs and get them through clinical trials. So you'll often take these from the company's estimates. They're very high in the beginning, but then as the drug launches and enters its commercial period, they tend to fall, and patent-protected drugs often have operating margins of 50%, 70%, or potentially even higher than that. In this example, we've made some very simple assumptions here and just set most of these to percentages of revenue based on comparable public companies. And the end result of all this is that if you look at the operating margin, the EBIT margin right here, it's around 70% in each year just because all the hard work has been done up front. Unlevered free cash flow factors in all the usual items as well as net operating losses. So if you look at the unlevered free cash flow calculation, we start with net operating profit after taxes, and in this case it reflects the cash taxes, and therefore it also reflects the impact of NOLs, the ones that were created early on and the ones that get used up, and then we add back the D&A and subtract CapEx and the change of working capital, and both these are fairly small overall. One of the most notable differences in biotech valuations is that with the discount rate, you can either start it at a much higher level, such as 30 to 40%, and then reduce it over time as a drug launches and becomes commercialized and starts generating revenue, or you can use a single discount rate, such as 10 or 12%, but then probability weight the unlevered free cash flows based on the chances of that drug reaching phase 2, phase 3 of clinical trials, and beyond that, and eventually getting commercial approval. So in this analysis, we probability adjust all the unlevered free cash flow numbers. So we take the normal number and then we multiply by the relevant probability of going from where we're at right now, phase 2 of clinical trials, to phase 3, to regulatory review, to an eventual commercial launch. There is no terminal value because we assume that the cash flows fall to close to zero by the end of this 20 or 30-year forecast period. And in my view, that makes the valuation more honest than in many other industries because we admit that this company is not going to last forever. Its products are not going to sell forever. They have a certain time period in which they'll be useful and have a market, and then after that, they'll decline and go to zero. So that is the very short version of biotech valuation. Let's go into this in a little bit more detail now, and I will show you some more of the Excel work and where the data comes from. So I'll start with the revenue and expenses, then we'll go into the discount rate, probabilities, and terminal value. I will discuss valuation multiples briefly, even though they are less useful for biotech firms, especially pre-revenue biotech firms. And then I'll explain some of the added complexities when you get to real-life biotech valuations. So with the revenue and expenses, the most important assumption is that we are modeling a regulated, patent-protected drug that gets a time-limited monopoly if it is successful. So if it passes all its clinical trials and gets government and regulatory approval, they have a certain number of years to the market all to themselves. What that means is that prices can stay high for a rather long period, sometimes up to 10 years, plus or minus a few years, but eventually generic competitors will enter and force prices down and probably reduce demand as well because many other companies will be offering effectively the same thing. Now, the normal starting point is to look up the number of people with a disease or condition, the percent that are diagnosed, and then the market share or market penetration percentage, and use that for at least some of the revenue forecasts. In the case of this company, Antios, you can look in their investor presentation. They make drugs for the hepatitis B infection, and they actually give an estimate here of how many globally are infected, how many new infections there are per year. So they're giving us all this information, and of course we could cross-reference it, but the baseline numbers are all taken from there. So if you go back to our Excel file, you'll see that we're using very, very similar numbers. We start with the number of adults that have it, and then we assume that only a small percentage of these are actually addressable. Because in this case, with a condition like chronic HBV, a lot of the sufferers here are based in places like Africa, which don't really have advanced medical care for the most part, and they're not really going to be buying these drugs for $6,000 a year. They don't have government provided insurance. They don't have private insurance plans that are going to cover that. So they're not really part of the addressable population in this case, which is why this percentage is quite low. With the market share, it's always a little bit hard to decide this, and this is something that you want to definitely build in the ability to vary over time, which we do here, but you could certainly look at other companies that have provided similar drugs and say that in a very large market like this, it's not really realistic to go above about 1% for the market share of these addressable patients. So that's how we get to some of the numbers here. So I'm just summarizing some of what we just went through here. There's a huge percentage of people with this disease that are simply undiagnosed or that do not have access to advanced medical care, so they can't even take advantage of this drug even if they wanted to. The market share does tend to be quite low, such as under 10% or under 1% in a very big market, simply because it's very difficult to reach tens of millions of people. Now, if the addressable market here were 1,000 people per year or 5,000 people per year, then it might be plausible to say that it gets to 50% or 70% market share, but it's just not plausible in this case. The ramp to peak sales often takes around 4 to 8 years. So in this case, you can see that it's actually one of the adjustable assumptions that we set the initial year in the market, and then we also set the peak market share year here, and we simply make the market share increase incrementally between the initial year and the peak market share year. So this is something you can definitely adjust, but you can also look at similar drugs. We looked at Entyvio for Crohn's disease here as a reference because it was similar in some market respects and found that it took about 5 to 6 years to reach peak sales. So you can definitely look at historical precedents and see how long it takes. With the pricing, you might have noticed that we are assuming some very, very high prices here of over $6,000 per patient per year, and this actually climbs to more like $9,000 by the end. This may seem exorbitant to you, but keep in mind that there is historical precedent for all this. Specifically, we looked up the prices for similar hepatitis B drugs and found all the numbers online. Remember that in most cases, the government is paying for this if you're in Europe or Canada or somewhere like that. And if you're in another country like the US, it might be a private insurance plan that pays for all or some of it. So it's not as if individuals are actually paying this full price up front. With the expenses, it's most important to get these right during the development period. So if you go back and look at our model here, The G&A expenses are pretty substantial in this period, and so are the R&D expenses, amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars to develop this drug. And in this case, phase 1 has already happened, and some of phase 2 has already happened, so it's actually higher than the R&D expenses shown here. But these come directly from the company's filings. In this case, afterward is where the margins really start to increase and go up to 50%, 70%, or even higher than that. Because frankly speaking, the hard part in biotech is actually developing the drug and making it work and winning regulatory approval in the first place. Once you do all that, if it is run correctly, it doesn't really cost all that much to market, sell, produce, and manufacture the drug relative to its upfront research and development costs. CapEx and the change in working capital are very modest because most biotech startups do not actually manufacture anything themselves. They're mostly outsourcing this and paying other companies to do it. So you can see with our assumptions here, the CapEx and D&A and change in working capital assumptions are all very low percentages of revenue, which is pretty standard in this industry. They're not major value drivers for these types of companies for the most part. NOLs are important because almost 100% of biotech startups will have them. The usage may be limited based on the region and the time period. For example, NOLs expire in some countries. In other countries, you might only be able to use a certain percentage of the NOLs each year. So in this example, the NOLs do not actually expire, but in the US at this time, they could only be used to offset about 80% of the taxable income, which is why when you go down and look at the NOL forecasts and projections here and the NOLs used, yes, the company has EBIT of 135 million. But if you look at the NOLs used right here, we're only using 108 million because we can only offset 80% of this taxable income with the net operating losses that we've accumulated over time. So you just have to be careful for those types of things. And when you calculate unlevered free cash flow, you always want to be using the company's cash taxes after the impact of these NOLs. Unlevered free cash flow is the formula that I showed you before. We set it up a little bit differently because NOPAT here actually deducts the cash taxes and we don't have a whole setup with deferred versus book taxes. So that's how the revenue and expenses work. Let's talk about the discount rate, the probabilities, and the terminal value now. So as I said before, the two main approaches are to start with a rather high discount rate, such as 30 or 40%, and then make it decline to a normal range over time, maybe 10 to 15% over the phases. So maybe it drops to 20% in phase 3, and maybe it drops to 15% in the regulatory approval phase, and then maybe it drops to more like 10% in the commercial phase. Something like that might be reasonable. Or you could also just take a standard normal discount rate for established companies, calculate WACC as you normally would, and then probability weight all the cash flows. Where people get tripped up is they often try to apply both of these at the same time, but you have to pick one. In other words, if you probability weight the cash flows and the other line items, you cannot start with a higher discount rate and make it decline over time. It has to be one or the other. Either use a normal discount rate and probability weight, or start with a higher discount rate and then make it decline over time. We tend to use the second approach here simply because it is much easier to find this data on the success probabilities. You can easily look online and find the probability of success of going from phase 1 to phase 2, phase 2 to phase 3, phase 3 to regulatory approval to commercial launch. You can find all these online for all different types of drugs in all different areas. So we find it a little bit easier to find the data and back up this approach. The terminal value should really be 0 because the cash flows drop to almost 0 by the end. And if you look at our approach here, you can see it where we're taking the present value of the cash flows from this drug, but we're saying the present value, the terminal value is 0 explicitly, and then we're just adding cash and subtracting debt to get the implied equity value. And this really is the normal approach for these types of pre-revenue companies. It would be quite an assumption to say that a company like this with just one product is going to have a terminal value 20 or 30 years into the future. There are some exceptions for platform companies that actually keep developing and acquiring new drugs over time, but most simple pre-revenue biotech startups do not fall into this category. I want to briefly discuss valuation multiples here because you can use them, though they are less useful because of the fact that biotech valuation is based on what's going to happen 20 years into the future, not what happened last year or what's going to happen over the next year or two. Probably the two most common approaches here are to use revenue multiples based on L plus 5 or L plus 4, so launch year plus 5 years or launch year plus 4 years, or if you're looking at precedent transactions, something like the T plus 4 revenue multiple. So the transaction date, and then you go 4 years into the future past that. You could also ignore going forward a certain number of years and just look at the peak sales multiples, which are based on whenever they think peak sales are going to occur. You take the enterprise value and divide by that number to get the enterprise value to peak sales multiple. Now, with this approach, you need to be very careful with screening because these types of L+5 and T+5 multiples really make the most sense with pre-revenue companies. Sometimes you can also use them if they're very early stage companies with very low revenue, but if it's a mid-revenue company, you don't really want to use something like this. So if the company is already launched 4 years ago, they have $1 billion in revenue, you probably won't want to use these revenue multiples. You'd probably want to use more traditional 1 year forward and 1 year trailing revenue, EBITDA, and net income multiples in that case. So I'm going to bring up a few examples here. This is an Evercore valuation where they go forward a few years to the 2029 estimated revenue and they take multiples based on that. And then if you look at the precedent transactions, they use T+4 revenue multiples. So they go forward 4 years past the transaction announcement date, take the enterprise value and divide by revenue in that 4th year. I have another presentation from Lazard here where they do something similar for the precedent transactions. L+5 revenue and then enterprise value divided by the L+5 revenue, and the multiples here come out to just around 1x for all these companies. So that's what you can do. The data can be tricky to get, the screening can be tricky, and so that's why we do not rely on them, but they are certainly options if you're working in this sector. So looking at all this, you might think that biotech valuation seems pretty easy so far. So what actually makes it difficult? The first complexity is that many companies have multiple drugs at different development stages in different markets with very different pricing and expense profiles. The second complexity is that other companies operate more like platform firms, so they're constantly developing and acquiring new drugs. They don't just have 1 or 2 early stage drugs that have yet to be developed or launched. With the first issue, you'll typically see separate DCFs, and with the second issue, you'll usually see a more traditional DCF with the company's mature products projected separately from their new and speculative products, and you might see a separate revenue projection for the more speculative products along with a probability adjustment in that case. So with the first case of an early stage company with multiple products, I have an example here for Ventyx Biosciences, which is also from our course, where we take the present value of 2 of their major drugs, we make simple estimates for the others, but then for the 2 major drugs, we actually have separate tabs with separate projections and very different expense profiles, different risk and probability adjustments, and all sorts of other assumptions like that. And we bring everything back to the main DCF. There is still no terminal value. It's a sum of the parts valuation, but we sum up the values of each of their different products to get the implied enterprise value, and then we back into the implied equity value based on that. The terminal value could potentially exist if you are modeling a platform company, but it depends very heavily on their strategy and what they're doing. And even if it does exist, you might model it somewhat differently and assume that the company's cash flows actually decline over time. They're still worth something going into the terminal period, but much less than a traditional company that is still growing would be. So that's about it. Let's do a quick recap and summary. We started with the revenue and expenses. Revenue is based on the addressable patient population times the market share or market penetration times the price per patient per year. You can find all these based on historical precedents. Expenses are typically linked to similar public companies that have launched drugs like this before, and they tend to be very high up front and then much lower in the commercial period. With the discount rate, the probabilities, and the terminal value, we prefer to use a single discount rate based on the comparable companies and then probability adjust the cash flows. So the success probabilities in the beginning are quite low, but they increase by the end. And what that means is that the overall percentage that you're multiplying by is somewhat higher in the beginning, and then it decreases by the end to reflect the fact that there's a good chance the drug will never make it through the regulatory approval process and actually get out to market. The terminal value is typically 0, but there could be cases where you have a modest terminal value based on some amount of cash flows, even if those decline over time. You see this more often for platform companies. You could use valuation multiples as well. The most common approaches are revenue multiples based on going forward 4 or 5 years or something in that range, or just going to the year of the peak sales for the company and taking the enterprise value divided by revenue at that point. Added complexities in real life occur when you have a company with multiple different products with very different expense and market profiles, and when you have a company that operates like more of a traditional one where they have mature products that don't really expire. They keep developing and acquiring new ones, and you'll see some different setups there, such as probability adjustments being applied to some drug lines but not to others. That's about it for this tutorial. Hopefully now you know a little bit more about biotech valuation and you have a few simple examples you can apply in real life.